One of the most effective ways to stop translating in your head while learning a new language is to start identifying objects around you in that language. If you're studying English, for example, try to look around your room or environment and name the objects in English instead of your native language. This may seem like a small thing, but it helps shift your thinking. Instead of immediately associating an object with the word in your first language, you begin associating it directly with the word in English. So, if you're looking at a computer, don't think of the word computer in your native language. Instead, immediately think of the English word computer. This simple practice gets you into the habit of thinking in your target language, rather than translating everything in your head over time. As you get used to identifying things in English, you can apply this to other everyday situations too. For example, if you're making breakfast, instead of thinking of eggs in your native language, start saying the word eggs in English. This will help you internalize new vocabulary and make it feel more natural when you speak or hear it in real conversations. The key is to associate the words with the actual objects or situations in your life, rather than relying on translations. By doing this regularly, you start to immerse yourself in the language, making it part of your daily routine. As you get more comfortable with this, you can expand it to more abstract concepts too. For example, if you're talking about emotions, instead of translating the word for happy from your language, try to feel it in English first. The goal is to reduce the gap between the object or situation and the language itself, bypassing the need for translation. Eventually, you'll reach a point where you don't even need to think about the translation at all. This method not only strengthens your vocabulary, but also improves your overall fluency. So, whether you're walking through your house, sitting at your desk, or just out on a walk, start identifying things in English and make that language a part of your life. It's a simple yet powerful way to begin thinking in your target language, reducing the reliance on translation and enhancing your language learning experience. Another great way to stop translating in your head while learning a language is to repeat the phrases you hear native speakers use. This tip is all about mimicking the natural flow of conversation. For example, when you watch TV shows, movies, or even YouTube videos, pay close attention to how native speakers form their sentences. If you hear a phrase you haven't come across before or one that sounds interesting, try to repeat it out loud. Don't just passively listen, say it yourself. This will help you get used to the rhythm and pronunciation of the language. It's important to repeat the phrases exactly how you hear them. Native speakers often use expressions and combinations of words in ways that might not translate directly into your native language, but that's part of the beauty of language learning. For instance, you might hear a phrase like "what's up" or "how's it going" in casual conversation. By repeating those phrases, you'll start to sound more natural when you use them in your own conversations. The more you practice, the more familiar these expressions will feel, and they'll eventually become a natural part of your vocabulary. If you're in a public place where you can't practice out loud, try to find a private spot where you can speak freely without worrying about people listening to you. Even if you're not in a position to practice with others, saying the words out loud helps your mouth get used to forming the sounds correctly. Your brain will also start to associate the sounds with the right meaning, making it easier to recall the words when you need them. Repetition is key to improving your pronunciation and fluency. By repeating the phrases you hear from native speakers, you're also learning how they connect words, use intonation, and express ideas in a more fluid, natural way. You're training your brain to think in the language, and over time, you'll find that you don't need to translate from your native language anymore. If you're reading a book in your target language, try reading out loud, especially if you come across a sentence that's difficult or interesting. Even if it feels awkward at first, reading out loud helps reinforce what you've learned and gets you used to the flow of the language. This technique might feel a little uncomfortable at first, but it's incredibly effective for improving both your speaking and listening skills. Ultimately, repeating phrases from native speakers not only helps with pronunciation, but also boosts your confidence in using the language in real conversations. The more you practice, the less you'll find yourself translating in your head, and the more natural speaking the language will feel. One of the best ways to stop translating in your head when learning a language is to immerse yourself in situations where you can't rely on your native language. This means finding environments where you have no choice but to use the language you're studying. It can be intimidating at first, but putting yourself in situations where you must use the target language will push you to think and speak in that language more naturally. For example, if you have the chance to travel to a country where the language is spoken, take advantage of every opportunity to interact with locals. Whether it's ordering food, asking for directions, or simply chatting with someone, the more you practice, the more comfortable you'll get. If traveling isn't an option, you can still create immersive experiences in your daily life. One effective way is by engaging with people who speak only your target language. For instance, you might find a conversation partner who is a native speaker or someone who speaks the language fluently and is willing to help you practice. If you have friends who speak the language, ask them to switch to it during your interactions. You'll quickly realize that you won't have the luxury of falling back on your native language, and that's when the real learning happens. Another way to immerse yourself is by joining activities or hobbies where the language is spoken. Whether it's a language club, a cooking class, or an art group, joining a community where everyone communicates in the target language is a great way to practice. You'll find that you're learning new vocabulary and expressions based on real-life interactions, which will make the language feel more practical and applicable. Of course, immersion doesn't always have to be with other people. You can immerse yourself in the language by surrounding yourself with media, such as books, movies, and music in your target language. Watching a movie or reading a book without subtitles forces you to rely on your understanding of the language, helping you to get used to how the language sounds and flows in real-world situations. The key is to find opportunities where you have no choice but to use the language. It might be difficult or even embarrassing at first, but this is where the real growth happens. As you make mistakes and learn from them, you'll start to feel more confident. The more you practice in these immersive environments, the less you'll feel the need to translate from your native language, and eventually, speaking the target language will come more naturally. A great way to stop translating in your head while learning a language is to watch TV shows and movies in your target language without using subtitles. This method helps you focus more on the language itself rather than relying on reading translations. While subtitles can be helpful when you're starting out, they often distract you from truly listening to how words are used in natural conversation. If you've watched a movie or show a few times with subtitles, try turning them off the next time. At first, it might feel challenging, but you'll soon notice that you're paying more attention to the actor's body language, tone of voice, and the context of the scene, all of which will help you better understand the language. When you watch without subtitles, your focus shifts to listening carefully to how words are used and how sentences are structured. This helps you become more attuned to the flow of the language. Don't worry if you don't catch every single word, just focus on the main ideas. Over time, you'll begin to pick up on more and more words, expressions, and patterns in the language. One of the benefits of this approach is that it trains your ear to recognize sounds and words in a natural setting, which is crucial for becoming fluent. Another great tip is to experiment with closed captions in your target language. For example, if you're learning English, try watching a movie in English with closed captions in English, rather than in your native language. This will help reinforce what you hear by associating the spoken word with its written form. If you're studying a language like Spanish, French, or German, Closed captions in that language can be especially helpful for reinforcing the vocabulary you're learning. It's a great middle ground between having no subtitles at all and relying too heavily on them. The more you practice with media in your target language, the less you'll feel the need to translate what you hear into your native language. As you get used to listening and understanding without translating, you'll start thinking in your target language instead of constantly translating in your head. This shift is one of the most powerful steps toward fluency. Plus, watching TV shows and movies can be fun and engaging, so you're not only learning the language, but also enjoying the process. Ultimately, watching TV and movies without subtitles or with closed captions in your target language is a simple yet effective way to immerse yourself in the language. It helps you improve your listening skills, learn new vocabulary, and get used to the natural rhythms and patterns of conversation in real-life situations. One of the most important tips to stop translating in your head when learning a new language is to avoid relying on a dictionary during conversations. It's tempting to reach for your phone or dictionary the moment you don't know a word, but doing this interrupts the flow of the conversation and can make it harder for you to truly engage with the language. Imagine you're having a conversation with a native speaker and you don't know the word for something you want to say. If you immediately pull out your dictionary and search for the word, the conversation stops while you search for it, which breaks the natural rhythm. This not only disrupts the conversation, but also takes away from your ability to think quickly in the language. Instead, try to describe the word you don't know. If you can't find the exact word you're looking for, explain it with other words or use gestures to get your point across. This approach keeps the conversation flowing and helps you practice how to use the language in real time. If the person you're talking to doesn't understand what you're trying to say, they may offer the word for you, which is a great learning opportunity. You'll remember the word better because it's been taught to you in context rather than just reading it in a dictionary. Using a dictionary during a conversation can also make you dependent on it, and you don't want to become too reliant on it. In real-life conversations, you won't have time to pull out a dictionary, and you need to be able to think on your feet. By practicing conversation without a dictionary, you'll become more comfortable with improvising and using the language naturally. The goal is to reduce the time you spend thinking in your native language and shift to thinking directly in the target language. If you find yourself stuck and unable to describe the word, try asking your conversation partner, "What's the word for?" Or "How do you say this in your language?" Asking for help is a great way to learn new words and reinforce what you've already learned. It's also a good opportunity to practice how to form questions and communicate more effectively in the language. Ultimately, the key to improving your fluency is to resist the urge to reach for a dictionary during conversations. The more you practice thinking on your feet and describing things in your target language, the more confident you'll become in your speaking ability. Over time, you'll rely less on translations and start thinking directly in the language, making your conversations more natural and fluid. A simple yet effective way to stop translating in your head while learning a new language is to train yourself to respond quickly to common questions. In any language, certain questions come up all the time, like "How are you?" or "What's your name?" These are questions that, as a language learner, you should be able to answer without thinking too much. The key is to make these responses feel automatically a simple, yet effective way to stop translating in your head while learning a new language is to train yourself to respond quickly to common questions. In any language, certain questions come up all the time, like "How are you?" or "What's your name?" These are questions that, as a language learner, you should be able to answer without thinking too much. The key is to make these responses feel automatic, so you don't need to stop and translate them in your head every time someone asks you. For example, in English, when someone asks, "How are you?" You should be able to respond right away with a simple answer like "I'm good," "I'm fine," or "not bad." If it takes you a long time to think of a response, that's a sign you need to practice it more. The goal is to make these responses second nature. So when you hear these questions, your brain automatically switches to the language and provides a response without the need for translation. Teak. So you don't need to stop and translate them in your head every time someone asks you. For example, in English, when someone asks, "How are you?" you should be able to respond right away with a simple answer, like "I'm good," "I'm fine," or "not bad." If it takes you a long time to think of a response, that's a sign you need to practice it more. The goal is to make these responses second nature. So when you hear these questions, your brain automatically switches to the language and provides a response without the need for translation. You can practice this by using common questions you know will come up in conversations. Make a list of typical greetings and questions, and rehearse your answers until you can say them quickly and confidently. For instance, practice how to respond to questions like, "Where are you from?" or "What do you do for a living?" The more you practice these types of questions and answers, the faster your responses will become, and the less you'll rely on translating in your head. If you don't know the answer to a question right away, don't be afraid to ask for clarification. For example, if someone asks you something and you're not sure what they mean, it's okay to say, "Sorry, can you repeat that?" or "I don't understand." The more comfortable you get with these standard responses, the easier it will be to keep the conversation going without having to stop and think about every word. Practicing quick responses to common questions also helps you build confidence. When you don't have to pause and search for the right words, you can focus more on the flow of the conversation. This makes speaking feel more natural and less stressful. As you get better at answering quickly, you'll notice that it becomes easier to respond to more complex questions as well. Eventually, you'll be able to participate in conversations without constantly translating in your head, and speaking the language will feel much more fluid. Ultimately, training your brain to quickly respond to common questions is an easy way to reduce translation and make your speaking skills more automatic. The more you practice, the more confident you'll become, and the less you'll need to rely on thinking in your native language. One of the most effective strategies to stop translating in your head while learning a new language is to study with materials that don't provide a translation. When you use textbooks, worksheets, or language apps that have your native language side by side with your target language, it's easy to rely on those translations to help you understand. However, studying with materials that only present the target language, or at least provide simplified explanations in that language, can be a much more beneficial approach in the long run. This method helps you start thinking directly in the language without needing to rely on the constant crutch of translation. At first, this may feel difficult or overwhelming because you won't be able to immediately understand everything. But over time, as you encounter more words and phrases in the target language, you'll begin to make connections and understand the meanings of words from context. You'll learn to think about the language in a more intuitive way, which is exactly what happens when you're immersed in a language. Simplified explanations in your target language help you see how the language works without the interference of your native language, and this pushes you to adapt to the language's structure and vocabulary more naturally. For example, if you're studying English, try using materials like picture books or language learning resources that explain grammar rules and vocabulary in English. Even if the vocabulary or grammar seems complex at first, you'll gradually begin to pick up on the meaning through repetition and context. It's like learning how a child learns their first language by hearing it, seeing it, and using it repeatedly until they start making sense of it. The advantage of using materials in your target language is that it forces you to become more independent in your learning process. Instead of constantly turning to your native language for clarification, you're learning how to think directly in your target language. It's a more natural approach that will ultimately lead to better comprehension and fluency. The more you practice with these types of materials, the less you'll feel the need to translate, and you'll begin to internalize the language. You don't have to completely avoid resources in your native language, but where possible, try to find materials that offer simple explanations in the target language. This could include children's books, beginner-level podcasts, or videos with subtitles in your target language. Over time, this approach will help you make a smooth transition from thinking in your native language to thinking directly in the language you're studying. A powerful way to stop translating in your head while learning a language is to study phrases in addition to individual vocabulary words. While learning individual words is important, understanding how those words are used in context is equally crucial. Phrases give you a much clearer idea of how to use vocabulary naturally in everyday conversations. For example, the word crazy can mean a lot of different things depending on how it's used. It might describe someone who is mentally unwell, something that's amazing, or even something that's terrible. By studying how crazy is used in phrases, like that's crazy, or she's acting crazy, you begin to understand its various meanings and how it fits into different situations. When you only learn individual words, it's easy to get confused about how they should be used in real conversations. But when you focus on phrases, you start to see the patterns that native speakers use in their everyday speech. For instance, you might learn phrases like "how's it going?" or "what's up?" These phrases are used in casual conversations, and you need to understand their meaning and context to use them correctly. Learning them as whole expressions instead of just focusing on the individual words helps you sound more natural and fluent. Additionally, studying phrases allows you to learn chunks of language that you can quickly apply in real conversations. This is much more efficient than trying to put together sentences word by word in the moment. For example, if you've already learned the phrase, "Can you help me?" you don't need to think about the individual words when you need to ask someone for assistance. It's already stored in your mind as a ready-to-use expression, making your communication more efficient and less stressful. By learning phrases, you also get a deeper understanding of the culture associated with the language. Many phrases carry cultural significance or are used in specific social situations. For example, expressions like "take care" or "how have you been" are not only words, but are also part of the way people connect with each other socially. The more you learn these phrases, the more you'll understand the culture and communication style of native speakers. Ultimately, studying phrases, not just individual words, will help you stop translating in your head and start thinking more naturally in the language. It helps you understand how words are used in context and gives you ready-made expressions to use in real conversations. Over time, you'll be able to use the language with much more confidence and fluency.